All right, so I'm going to get started and other folks will join us. Um, I'm joined by Casey Mastrup, who's just shared something with you. So thank you for being the moderator today and helping us. The structure of this is I'm going to be talking through a tool, a protocol that I used this past spring. We call it the Interactive Supervision Journal. I'm going to be showing you the tool, talking about how it works. I'm going to show you some examples of students' responses in that tool. And I'm also going to talk about things we learned through the spring, because as hard as the spring was, it was also a big learning opportunity. I learned a ton of things from the spring. So if you all would go to the chat, you'll find the document that I'll be working from. And I'm going to bring up some things along the way. So first up, I'm going to go through some of the reasons why we went to this particular tool. So in the spring, as we all had happen, is suddenly we didn't have access to schools. We weren't able to get into classrooms and visit our student teachers, and our student teachers where we were had no access to being with their own kids. Advantages for us this past spring that we have to think about for the fall is at least our student teachers had made solid relationships with their cooperating teachers and had really good relationships with their kids already. So the spring was okay in those ways. We also had, and this is something that we're going to think about for the fall, in districts we work with, and I don't know about across the state as well, there were restrictions on video recording of students in virtual classrooms. So there's an ethical, moral issue about that. So we couldn't have just the student teachers teaching virtually and work from their recordings. So we were trying to find a way to have some kind of work supervision around teaching activity for our student teachers in their rooms or with their kids, but all of a sudden all the things we would normally expect weren't there. The other thing that came up along the way is that we wanted to push on supervision, something I've been working on for a while now, and something I think is worth considering is that we should maybe be pushing beyond the formal observations. I do a lot of informal observations, checking in with my students, conferences and such, but the way that student teachers structured and pushed by the state focuses a lot on those few formal observations. What I push instead is I push towards what I call the long conversation. And I tell my students this at the very beginning of our work together in the fall, in the summer, the end of summer, is that everything we're doing from the beginning of their student teacher through the end of their program is a long conversation. We're just coming back to it again and again and again. So moving beyond the idea of a few instances of mentorship to having an ongoing mentoring relationship. And this tool was built around that as well. The other reason for working on this tool that I'll share in just a moment is pushing beyond what we consider what counts for student teachers' work. So we do lesson plans and we observe them doing those things, but there's lots of other things teachers do that we don't account for necessarily in our supervision. And this tool was a way to try to capture those things. The other thing that came up from this, and it was a way for us to make things happen worthwhile in the COVID situation, is we need some way to measure what was happening with student teaching during remote teaching and during the COVID time in spring. So this tool helped us do that. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to share that tool with you so you can get an overview of what it looks like. Let's see. Looks like this. And the things that I want you to pay attention to are just the structure of it, okay? So we were doing our last quarter student teaching. We're on a quarter system at UC Santa Cruz. And we were trying to think about what should matter. So the idea behind it all is that this would set up a conversation with the supervisor. It's not just an artifact where the students are just generating work and saying, yes, I did that. All of this is setting up a conversation an instructional conversation with the supervisor, with me. So we organized it this way. The first block of this was all just about capturing teaching activity. And when we were designing this for the spring, we were going, well, what do we capture? Well, we don't know what's going to be there. And in some ways, this fit into our push towards thinking about UDL more in our own work with our student teachers now. What if student teachers got to share with us their own representations of their student teaching? Instead of always asking them for specific things, what if they could show us things that matter to them for themselves? So student teachers would talk about the artifacts, they would say who was involved, and there's links to artifacts. I'm going to show you a couple of these in a few moments. And then the next part, part two, is all about reflection, working through the activity. So we asked them to choose one activity from the week. These were weekly interactions, and they would be shared with the supervisors along the way. And the prompts are about the work they did within that activity. So detailed description of the activity, the kinds of prompts, models, materials, and how students were engaged. So we focus on what are the students doing, not so much about what you did as a teacher, but we always like to think about what matters in your teaching is your students' response to it. So what are students doing? So what was learned? What did students make or show you to do this? What challenges came up? How did you manage these? How would you manage these in future teaching? What questions came up for you about learning and teaching from your students' engagement in this activity? Describe how you supported students to engage and succeed. Describe how you supported those who struggled or needed support. Strengths of your teaching, be specific and tie to what students were doing. And again, always a student focus. What about your teaching would you like to improve from this activity or your work this week? Okay, and again, being specific, and the artifacts that mattered. And then this part, the next two parts were done with me. So I would meet with the student teacher, and we would go through all of this. It would be essentially a talk aloud, a think aloud. The student teacher would talk me through their activity for their week of teaching. As they went through this part two, I'd ask questions all along the way, like I said, an instructional conversation. And down here, we would co-construct this part. We'd write this together: strengths, concerns, areas for focus, next steps for improvement, and some general comment. In our particular program, we focused on some particular TPEs for this segment, but we put those in their places. The thing that matters in this as well is a lot of this is tied to what we expect in planning. So this is the form. What you will find in the notes that you're looking at now, you'll find a link to this, and you can use this. Let us know if it's useful to you. You should have my email address too. Give us some attribution if you want to do something similar. But let me go ahead and show you a couple things that came up along the way. So you have the tool. I'm going to show you a few of my students' work from this tool. So this is my Sarah, who's teaching in a 5th grade classroom. And you'll see that what she does is she talks about the things that she's doing. And what's wonderful about this is I got to see the variety of activities. So she held class meetings, she taught lessons, she did read alouds with tools. What was wonderful about Sarah is that she was teaching across the hall from one of my other student teachers, and they collaborated and worked together. And so they were able to share work in that way. And then you can see here, she's giving a description of the kinds of work she's doing. And in the conversation, when we go through this conversation, as a supervisor, I'm able to pull out questions, prompts, what things need to be thought about, what things need to be worked on along the way. And we continue the conversation through this. And she lists her artifacts. And then we talk about strengths, multiple modes of content delivery, students becoming confident in accessing materials, being constant, always there for students. These are things she did. And then suggestions, continue to find the good work in all that you are doing with your students. Keep finding the learning opportunities for yourself. And then this is a very particular thing about setting up questions to move the teaching. So this is an example of one student. I'm going to give you some richer examples of other students as well, things that came across. So this is my student Nick, and as you may have had experience too, Nick was not in Santa Cruz for his student teaching for spring. He was in Idaho, but he still worked with his teachers every day. And what he did is his focus is science education. He's found a good role as a science educator. And what he did with the students is he took on a science project. He had this thing called Constructing Your Own Garden Challenge. And he set out this expectation for what they're doing, and he set out the math and the science and all the things that he wanted his students to do. But then this is the good part, and this is all about capturing. We're thinking about capturing our student teachers' work and the student teaching. This is an artifact that I normally would not have gotten in my regular teaching, my regular work with student teachers. Here is Nick.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our last week of garden updates. So to start off our day, I just wanted to kind of show you around what's going on. So as you guys can see, just over the past weekend, this corn has gotten so much taller and so much bigger. And now we're having beans that are sprouting almost everywhere in the garden. And we're just getting our last few little squashes coming up in this garden, which is really exciting. And I'm excited to see how this Three Sisters garden builds. And we'll talk about this in a minute, or maybe later this week. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later this week.
So that's it. That is Nick in his garden. And the most wonderful thing that happened later on is in a later session, he shared with me videos his students made and shared with him of them in their own gardens. So he did this whole unit on gardening, and it was like the perfect COVID lesson. So what are we going to do with ourselves? Well, let's think about gardening. We'll think about biology. We'll think about math. And he made an example through his work in the video and through his tools, and kids carried it forward. And at the end of the spring, he had these students sending him videos of them essentially talking through their garden the way he's talking through his. So that's an example from Nick, and my ability to understand as a supervisor the nature of his work and the impact was made possible through the kinds of artifacts that were made available in this tool. So I'm going to share with you another one. This is my student Leah. A little different, but what's wonderful about her interaction, you can see that she did a lot of mini lessons. She worked really well with her cooperating teacher. I'm going to talk a little bit about things that were learned in her class as well. But she was able to take Eureka lessons or math lessons curriculum and make it work for herself. And we talked through different things that mattered, next steps. One of the things that came up a lot in all of the work that I did with student teachers in the spring was working out the front end, really investing in modeling things that needed to be done. So this was something that came out as a result of these conferences. There were things that we learned about teaching remotely through our interactions and conversations in these conferences. I'm going to share with you, this is my student Erin, and Erin was a very tech-savvy person. She was working in Cupertino with a very capable cooperating teacher, and their way of working was always to set out some kind of electronic agenda. And I'm going to talk about this in things that I learned along the way too, that she set out everything in quite detail, hyperlinks, giving explicit instructions for the kids along the way, lots of things about what to do with your time. This will be one of the things that I'm going to share about what I learned along the way. Just ways of sharing things that she's done with her kids and making sure that they were organized for their learning. This is another student. This student was working in a kindergarten classroom. And what was fascinating about this is that I had 2 kindergarten classrooms, and I had two different student teachers in kindergarten classrooms. One of the kindergarten classrooms was a complete failure this spring, and this classroom worked. And the reasons it worked, I'll discuss in a little bit. But I want to share with you something she shared with her peers. This is a lesson she was doing with kids about forces in motion.
Hello everyone, Teacher Esme here, and for today's science lesson, our essential question is what causes things to move? So I want you to think about what is causing the ball to move and what is causing the pins to move. So now that you've seen the ball move and the pins move, I'm going to challenge you to make your own bowling ball games. And I'm going to set up another video that walks you through how you can do that.
So I want to hold on to that walks you through part. That's going to be one of the things that was learned in these sessions. And Esme was one of the student teachers I had that I learned a great deal from, because she was in a kindergarten classroom, but they made it work for young kids, which was somewhat of a surprise. So what I'd like to do right now is just share some of the lessons I learned along the way using this tool. And then if we have a handful of minutes for discussion, Casey will help us with that too. So some lessons that were learned. Relationships matter. There needs to be space in our teaching for the human connection. A lot of our student teachers made spaces where they put a front end to any lesson where it's 5 minutes of just checking in with each other. Kids show up when they know that they are cared for, that someone's interested in them. The same thing happened with this work in this with the journal as well. This journal exercise, meeting with my student teachers once a week, made an opportunity for me to make the human connection with them, because I couldn't see them all the time. So we talk about a few things. We talk about teaching. We talk about how things were going. And as most of you probably had experience in the spring too, they're talking about, well, where are we going to be in the fall? Am I going to get a job? All those things. So part of this journal exercise was about the constancy of always connecting along the way. And for the student teachers, they kept sharing that they needed to make time in their teaching with their own students to just say hello. It's it's an incidental thing we do in the classroom because we can see kids, we can be informal with them, but it has to be built into the distance learning these days. I had at least one student, a couple students set up drop-in hours for students, just informal times to talk about schools and just to connect with them. One strong thing that came up in my conferences with this journal tool was that preparation matters. With the distance learning especially, all the things that are native to a classroom that express time and organization are not there. So we have to find ways, and these are all things my student teachers were telling me. They were telling me that they had to go about ways of showing kids how to use their time, what was happening next, how to use their tools. So student teachers taught their students about time, how the day should work with them. So Esme, the one who was doing the science work, actually did lessons with her kindergartners to tell them about how a morning works. Like, what do we do when we get up? What do we do next? What do we do for distance learning? How long are we going to do that? She spent time explicitly laying out how time works, because we can imagine for kids, all of a sudden things didn't work anymore. So I learned this was something that Esme offered me. Virtual routines mattered as much as regular classroom routines. In Erin's classroom, the student teacher who was in Cupertino, they had a schedule every day that was very clear, and she was very much involved in setting that out for her students. I had a student teacher in a 5th grade classroom who made videos about how to do things. So she would show her kids how to use Google Classroom or Padlet or anything else, because in the first week or so, they were finding that the teacher, her cooperating teacher, and she could not assume that kids knew how to use the technology. So this is about preparation, being in front of things again, and they did a good job with those things. The next piece, flexibility matters. Giving students the room to do the learning, representing learning in different ways matters to them. I'm connecting this to UDL. Early on in the use of this tool, it was apparent that I shouldn't make expectations about the shape of what they might offer me, because everything was up in the air this spring. So that actually was an advantage, because all of a sudden I got to see things that the student teachers chose to represent for themselves, which gave me a different insight into how I should be working with them. Leah, the student teacher, one of the student teachers I shared work with, she and her CT did something very special. They were used to having their whole class in the classroom before spring, and they would split lessons. She would teach, the student teacher would teach half and the CT would teach the other half perhaps. Well, they modified it for what happened in the spring. So students were broken down as small instructional groups, say 4 or 5 groups, and then the CT would teach one group the lesson of about 10 kids or 8 kids or 5 kids or whatever, and the student teacher would be taking part. But after that, the subsequent lessons had the student teacher teaching some of them and the CT teaching others, which was all moderated by different meeting times. Since all the kids didn't have to meet at the same time, they could switch up times and make sure that everybody got small group lessons. The reason they did this is they found that, and this came up for a lot of the student teachers, they found that they were losing kids during the spring, that kids would show up in Zoom, but they weren't really there. So this was one of the responses that came up that I learned from my student teachers through our work with the interactive journal. And then some student teachers made ad hoc groups depending on something kids were struggling with, something that they needed. This is something that came up in spring that was just a response to what was happening. This next part, peers matter. Grade level teams started working differently. I had reports through my work with my student teachers in this journal that a lot of grade level teams were doing the best work they'd ever done as a team. And then I had a few student teachers who found that they became the subject matter expert for a grade level team. So for Esme, the person who was doing the forces in motion lessons, she became the science lead for all the kindergarten classes for that entire school. That was her piece. Everything she did and shared became a resource for everybody else. So all of a sudden, a student teacher is a peer among other teachers in this case. And I had other student teachers who collaborated and shared things across classrooms, and there were things that they were very proud of. They got involved in science lessons, other kinds of things that were just really, really rich, and that you might not expect to see even in a traditional supervision setting. The last thing, just about parents. Learned a lot about parents along the way, all of us did, especially in Erin's classroom, the student teacher I had in Cupertino. Lots of parent communication, but lots of front-ending again, things that came up beforehand, helping people to understand what was happening in the classrooms. Lots of good work around that. Now I know we have a short time. We only have about 6 minutes left. I've run through and talked through a lot of things that we've done around this supervision journal. If anybody, I'm gonna drop out of this sharing mode. All of you have this document. A few minutes for any questions or thoughts, something similar that anybody's experienced or worked with. I'd appreciate that.
I have a question for you, Johnny. This is Anne out of UC Santa Barbara. I really appreciate the restructuring of the reflection in the interactive journal. I think that definitely during COVID, some sort of interactive journal is really important, and I can see it being just as helpful even when we get to supervise in person again. And I'm curious what your thoughts are of how, and I don't even know. Okay, well, here's my question. So we typically observe and then debrief with the candidate soon thereafter, and there's not a lot of time for them to, they do their reflecting out loud with us. And I'm really appreciating the opportunity for them to reflect quietly on their own. I feel like it would help them take a lot more ownership over their teaching and learning, instead of showing up to a debrief, just looking at us and saying, okay, what did you think and how did it go? And they just kind of take our word as gospel and don't engage in that critical thinking on their own as much. And I'm wondering if you did this before COVID happened, before remote instruction happened, and how long you gave them to reflect, and how you scheduled debriefs so long after an observation.
I appreciate this. So I will put this out there, and this is something I considered even before this was happening, that there needed to be some parallel activity to those formal observations, because I find them wanting. I find some of the things about the formality of it, and it's about, you know, there's arguments about student teachers believing that they're trying to perform. We struggle with the whole evaluative nature of formal observations. If student teachers understand them as evaluative, do they do things differently if they, and how would they think about them differently if they understood that they were formative? So if we think about the journals are set up to be formative conversations. They're not evaluative. let's talk about how things are going. Let's talk about what things you might do to get better at what you're doing. And the constancy, and I appreciate the question from Sarah, I met with them every week. So I'm at home, everybody's at home these days. And I spend 45 minutes with them in conference. So I had 15 of them, but of course the thing is it was spring, it was supposed to be full-time student teaching. And normally I would be out in the field full-time visiting them. So, you know, this was the piece that fit that part. And then going back to that piece, and I'd appreciate this too, just that in prior times, the way that I would normally go through a formal observation is I have a pre-conference where we actually look at the planning, their planning live, and we look at it critically, and we talk about, you know, how's this going to work? The other thing that I have them do in the pre-conferences is actually have them do a mental talk through, a rehearsal of what they're doing, so that what happens in the post-conference is related to that first part as well. It's not like you have a lesson, you say you're going to be doing this, I watched you do this, now let's talk about it. We've already started the conversation. So an essential thing about this journal is it's a long conversation. It's something that we continue to come back to. So you can imagine that after 1 week we've done this work, I come back to them the next week, we still talk about the things they're already doing, and I still have those available. So we're thinking about teaching as a constant long activity rather than instances. And I appreciate this really very much. And anyone else have a question right now?
Yeah, Johnny, I just want to say thank you very much. This is Orlando from UC Davis. And Nick had said something. He said, no, you had said something about Nick. You said, this is Nick in his garden. And
yeah.
Well, that made me think that Nick is in his element. He is the one that's kind of driving, like, this is what I want to show you. This is what I want to share with you. This is what I want, you know, feedback with. And I just really appreciated, you know, that this places the students in the driver's seat and really being able to, you know, to lead the discussion and let you know what they want. So.
Well, I appreciate this. If you had just 1 second, I appreciate this, Orlando. Just that one of the things that comes up in the spring is we ask them to do a unit of study, teach a unit. But I always start with, what's in your heart? What do you care about? Because we always teach best. That is what is closest to us. And Nick he studies biology. He's a botanist, and so he got there. And then the conversation that I had with him afterwards, you can imagine. I'm sorry, I got spine tingling, whatever.
Yeah.
When he shared the kids' videos, it's like he did it. Yeah. He presented himself. He threw himself out there and said, "This is Nick. This is what I care about." Yep. And as much as we talk about teachers having to perform, you're not performing when you're really yourself doing the thing you care about. That's and right. The kid got that, and they gave it back to him, which was a special thing.
Yeah.
Appreciate that, Orlando. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny.
Sorry.
If anybody else wants to ask, that'd be great. Margarita, please.
Do the resident teachers also have access to this? Do they take a look at it?
Well, this is a curious thing, because this would be like the next iteration. It would be the thing that we could share together in a different way, because it didn't happen the way, because we were all inventing things in the spring. But what I imagined and what could be made better is that since we're all remote, that conversation, that instructional conversation could be a three-way. It could be a triad, and that would be so much stronger. And it's something that I've been thinking about just in terms of my supervision over time too, that we do the dyads all the time, dyad, but we're all sharing this thing together. And I know all this, they're cooperating teachers well. So that one class where the student teacher was, where the cooperating teacher was smart and said, I'll do this first lesson with a small group, then you take a group and I'll take a group. That was all co-constructed, and I know them really well, and I could see how they're thinking. But if I'd been involved and heard that from them in a different way, that would have been really great for me too.
Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate this, Margarita. I didn't say it clearly enough. While we were doing those supervision journal conferences, I had my notes going, because they were telling me, because this is like, I had this complete open window into COVID remote teaching from every one of my student teachers about what was working and what was not working. It's like, whoa. And then my student teachers being sharp on those things in ways I would not have gotten in another context. because they had their eyes and ears open to things that maybe they wouldn't have paid attention to otherwise. And they were giving it to me, and I appreciated their generosity because I learned a ton this spring.
Well, thank you for sharing.
Johnny, just one quick question. You know, I usually talk to my students about what is your purpose, right? What is your purpose? Why are you here? You know, and get in tune with that so you can teach it. But you said it in a different way. You said, what is in your heart? What else did you say? Can you repeat what you said?
I'm sorry. It's always, it is that we always teach best what's in us, what we care about most. But I think we all kind of, because, yeah, it's one of the essential things I get to, and it's a developmental thing. It's one of the things that I save for springtime, because through the course of our program, they're so concerned with this and this and this and this. And then in springtime, it's supposed to be full-time student teaching for the elementary folks and for the other folks too. We and I purposely try to give them spaces where they express themselves as teachers, instead of just trying to go through and do this teacher thing. Because we talk about, you know, teacher identity is a big deal. Who am I as this person coming into something? And the other thing that I hold on to, and this is a prejudice, which is I value the stuff of teaching. So I'm often a math teacher, an art teacher. Those are things that I can teach really, really well. And I know for myself as a teacher, when I'm doing that content area, when we're sharing in that interesting thing together, it becomes less about me as the teacher and less about them as the learners, that we're sharing in this thing. And that, I mean, that extends to teaching too. When I'm talking to them as a teacher and they're talking to me as a teacher, we share in things differently. I think the journal did some of that work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you, Johnny.
Thank you both. Thank you all.
All right.
You have a
Take
great
care.
day. Bye-bye.